In the depths of an Alaskan wilderness where temperatures drop so low that your breath freezes before it leaves your lungs, something extraordinary happened that would challenge everything you think you know about wild animals and human compassion. Picture this. It's 3 in the morning, the kind of darkness that swallows sound and hope alike. A blizzard is tearing through the mountains with the fury of nature unleashed, winds howling at speeds that could knock a grown man off his feet. Most people would be huddled inside praying for morning. But Christopher wasn't most people. He was awake, not by choice, but because something had pierced through the storm's rage, something that made his blood run cold. At first, he thought it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. After all, when you live alone in the wilderness for months, your mind can conjure sounds that aren't there. But this was different. This was real. This was desperate. Have you ever heard a sound that reaches into your soul and refuses to let go? A sound so raw, so primal, that it strips away every civilized instinct and leaves you face to face with pure, unadulterated need? That's what Christopher heard that night. Not the mechanical cry of machinery failing in the storm, not the distant howl of wolves marking their territory. This was something else entirely. Something that spoke a universal language of pain and desperation that every living creature understands. He pressed his face against the frosted window, trying to peer through the wall of white that had transformed his world into an alien landscape. The snow was falling so thick it was like looking through television static. But there, just at the edge of his vision, he caught a glimpse of movement. A shadow against shadows. Something large. Something struggling. Christopher's heart began to race. In 30 years of practicing medicine in Chicago, he had developed an instinct for recognizing when life hung in the balance. That same instinct was screaming at him now. But this wasn't a patient in a sterile hospital room. This was the wild, unforgiving wilderness of Alaska, where one wrong decision could mean death for everyone involved. The sound came again, cutting through the storm like a knife through silence. Closer this time, more urgent, more desperate. It was a mother's cry, unmistakable in its anguish. Christopher had heard that same tone countless times in hospital corridors, in waiting rooms, in the moments when hope and despair wrestle for dominance. But he had never heard it from a wild animal before. As he stood there, frozen between fear and fascination, Christopher realized he was about to witness something that would change his understanding of the natural world forever. The storm outside wasn't just bringing snow and wind. It was bringing a test of character that would define the kind of man he truly was. Because sometimes, in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but ice and darkness, life presents you with a choice that reveals your very soul. What would you do if nature itself knocked on your door, bleeding and broken, asking for help in the only way it knew how? Would you turn away, telling yourself it's not your problem, that wild animals should stay wild? Or would you open that door, knowing that once you do, there's no going back? Christopher was about to find out. And what happened next would create a bond so powerful, so unexpected, that 2 years later, it would return to remind him that some connections transcend every boundary we think exists between the human world and the wild. Dr. Christopher Harrison had never intended to become a hermit. 6 months ago, he was Dr. Harrison, Chief of Emergency Medicine at Northwestern Memorial Hospital in Chicago, a man whose days were measured in heartbeats, whose nights were stolen by emergency calls, whose life revolved around the constant dance between life and death. He was respected, successful, and completely burned out. The decision to leave hadn't come suddenly. It had been building for years, like pressure in a fault line, waiting for the right moment to crack open and reshape everything. The final straw came on a Tuesday morning in March, when he lost a 7-year-old girl to complications that should have been preventable. Standing in that sterile hallway, watching her parents collapse under the weight of their grief, Christopher felt something break inside him that all his medical training couldn't fix. He submitted his resignation that afternoon. By May, he had sold his downtown condo, his BMW, everything that tied him to his old life. He took the money and bought something most people would consider insane. A remote cabin in the Alaskan wilderness, accessible only by a dirt road that disappeared under snow for 6 months of the year. No neighbors for 20 miles. No cell phone service. No internet. No connection to the world he was trying to escape. The cabin itself was modest, built by a previous owner who clearly understood the harsh realities of Alaskan winters. Thick log walls, a massive stone fireplace, solar panels that worked when the sun decided to show itself, and a generator for everything else. One bedroom, one bathroom, a kitchen that doubled as a living room, and a garage that served as storage for firewood, supplies, and the occasional tool repair project. Christopher had thought he wanted solitude. After 3 decades of being needed by everyone, every moment of every day, the idea of being needed by no one felt like freedom. He imagined long days of reading, of thinking, of healing from years of carrying other people's pain. He pictured himself learning to fish, maybe taking up woodworking, discovering who he was when he wasn't trying to save lives. But solitude, he discovered, had its own weight. The silence that he had craved in Chicago felt oppressive in Alaska. The endless hours stretched before him like a white canvas he didn't know how to fill. He found himself talking to the ravens that visited his property, having full conversations with the squirrels that raided his bird feeder. He started leaving the radio on just to hear human voices, even if they were strangers discussing weather patterns and road conditions in towns he'd never visit. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent his entire career being surrounded by people, and now that he was alone, he missed the very thing he had run from. But there was something else happening too, something he hadn't expected. Living in such close proximity to nature was awakening parts of himself that had been dormant for decades. He noticed things he had never seen before, the way morning light filtered through ice crystals on his windows, the intricate patterns frost made on fallen leaves, the complex social dynamics of the wildlife that shared his little corner of the world. He kept a journal, partly out of boredom, partly because he was beginning to understand that his time in Alaska was changing him in ways he couldn't yet articulate. He wrote about the moose that grazed in his yard every Tuesday, always alone, always cautious. He wrote about the family of foxes that had taken up residence under his deck, and how the parents took turns hunting while the others stayed with their kits. He wrote about the eagles that nested in the tall pine at the edge of his property, and how their hunting patterns changed with the weather. What he didn't write about because he couldn't find words for it was the growing sense that he was being prepared for something. Not in a mystical sense, but in the way a surgeon prepares for a complex operation, gathering skills and knowledge without knowing exactly when they'll be needed. His medical instincts hadn't disappeared just because he'd left the hospital. If anything, they had sharpened, freed from the bureaucracy and politics that had clouded his judgment for so long. He found himself noticing injuries in the animals he observed, understanding their body language in ways that surprised him. When the old moose showed up with a limp, Christopher could see it was favoring its left rear leg. When one of the fox kits seemed listless, he recognized the signs of illness. He never intervened, of course. This was their world, not his. He was just an observer, a guest who had been allowed to witness their daily struggles for survival. But deep down, Christopher was still a doctor. The Hippocratic oath he had taken 30 years ago didn't specify species. First, do no harm applied to all living things, didn't it? Help when you can meant exactly what it said. He just hadn't realized how literally he would be tested on those principles. His cabin, built for one solitary man seeking peace, was about to become something else entirely. It was about to become exactly what it had always been designed to be, even if Christopher didn't know it yet. A sanctuary. The storm had been building for 3 days, starting as gentle flurries that danced in the morning light and evolving into something that meteorologists would later classify as a Category 4 blizzard. Christopher had prepared as well as anyone could, stocking up on firewood, checking his generator, ensuring his emergency supplies were within easy reach. He had learned to read Alaska's moods, and this one promised to be particularly violent. By evening, the wind was screaming through the trees with such force that even the massive pines were bending like saplings. Snow wasn't falling so much as being hurled horizontally, creating a white wall that reduced visibility to mere inches. Christopher had given up any pretense of productivity and was sitting by his fireplace reading a mystery novel by lamplight when the generator suddenly coughed and died. The silence that followed was eerie. Without the gentle hum of electricity, the storm's fury seemed amplified. Christopher grabbed his flashlight and made his way to the garage, stepping out into wind so fierce it nearly knocked him over. The generator had ice coating its air intake, a problem he could fix, but it would take time. As he worked, clearing ice and checking connections, he became aware of a sound that didn't belong to the storm. At first it was so faint he thought he was imagining it. A low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. Christopher paused, listening intently. There it was again, closer this time. Not the crack of a falling tree, or the groan of his cabin settling under snow load. This was organic. This was alive. He finished with the generator and stepped back outside, flashlight beam cutting weakly through the blizzard. The sound came again, and this time Christopher's blood went cold. He knew that sound from nature documentaries, from camping trips in his youth when his father had taught him to recognize the calls of various animals. It was a bear's distress call, deep and guttural, filled with an anguish that transcended species. Christopher's first instinct was to get back inside and lock the door. Bears in distress were dangerous beyond measure, capable of destroying anything in their path. But something about the sound stopped him. It wasn't aggressive. It was pleading. It was the sound of a mother in crisis, and every parental instinct he had ever witnessed in 30 years of medicine recognized it immediately. He stood frozen in his doorway, flashlight beam dancing through the snow, when a shape emerged from the white chaos. At first it was just a dark mass moving slowly, deliberately. Then the beam caught a reflection of eyes, and Christopher's heart nearly stopped. A massive black bear was approaching his cabin, but she wasn't charging. She was walking with the careful, measured steps of someone carrying something precious. As she drew closer, Christopher could see what had driven her to seek human help in the middle of a deadly blizzard. Clutched against her chest was a cub, tiny and motionless, its fur matted with ice. The mother bear's own coat was covered in frost, and her breathing was labored, creating clouds of steam that the wind immediately tore away. She had been traveling for hours, maybe days, fighting through conditions that would kill most creatures. The bear stopped about 20 feet from Christopher's door and looked directly at him. In 30 years of medicine, he had seen that exact expression countless times on the faces of parents bringing their children to the emergency room. It was pure, desperate hope mixed with the terrible fear that they might be too late. The bear wasn't seeing him as a threat or as prey. She was seeing him as her only chance. Christopher's mind raced through everything he knew about bear behavior. This was unprecedented. Bears didn't seek human help. They avoided humans at all costs, especially protective mothers with cubs. But this mother had made a choice that went against every instinct her species possessed. She had chosen to trust the one creature that could possibly help her baby. The cub in her arms hadn't moved since Christopher first spotted them. From what he could see, it was hypothermic. Possibly worse. In the wild, that was a death sentence. But this wasn't the wild anymore. This was a moment when the natural order had been suspended, when desperation had created a bridge between two species that normally existed in separate worlds. Christopher realized he was holding his breath. The bear was still watching him, waiting for some sign of what would happen next. Her massive head was tilted slightly, and despite her fearsome appearance, there was something almost gentle in her posture. She wasn't demanding help. She was asking for it. The wind howled around them, driving snow so hard it stung Christopher's face like tiny needles. Time seemed suspended in that moment, as if the entire universe was waiting to see what choice would be made. Christopher thought about his medical oath, about the promise he had made to help when he could, to do no harm. He thought about the parents he had comforted over the years, the ones who had trusted him with their most precious possessions. He thought about the mother bear who had traveled through hell itself to bring her baby to the only hope she could find. Slowly, carefully, Christopher stepped back and opened his door wider. He didn't speak, didn't make any sudden movements. He simply stepped aside and waited. The bear's eyes never left his face as she considered this invitation. Then, moving with surprising grace for such a large creature, she walked toward the cabin. At the threshold, she paused again, as if asking permission one more time. Christopher nodded, a gesture he wasn't sure she would understand. but somehow knew she would. The bear stepped inside, bringing with her the smell of snow and wild places, and the desperate hope that sometimes miracles happen when they're needed most. Standing in his doorway with a wild bear inside his cabin, Christopher felt every instinct evolved over thousands of years screaming at him to run. His hands were shaking, not from the cold but from the adrenaline coursing through his system as his brain tried to process what he had just done. He had invited death itself into his home, and death had accepted graciously. The mother bear moved slowly through his living room, her massive frame making his furniture look like dollhouse pieces. She was larger than he had realized outside, easily 7 feet tall when she occasionally rose to her hind legs to navigate around his coffee table. Her claws clicked against his wooden floor with each step, a sound that reminded Christopher just how fragile the boundary was between civilization and wildness. But it was the cub that held his attention. Even in the dim light, Christopher could see the little bear was in critical condition. Its breathing was shallow and irregular, its tiny body limp in its mother's arms. Hypothermia certainly, but possibly internal injuries as well. In the hospital, Christopher would have had teams of specialists warming blankets, IV fluids, monitors, and every tool modern medicine could provide. Here he had whatever he could improvise. The mother bear had stopped near his fireplace, where the warmth was strongest. She gently lowered her cub to the floor, then stepped back and looked at Christopher with an expression he would never forget. It was complete trust, mixed with absolute desperation. She had done everything she could. Now it was up to him. Christopher's medical training kicked in, overriding his fear. This wasn't about species anymore. This was about saving a life, and he knew exactly what needed to happen. Moving slowly to avoid startling the mother, he went to his bedroom and gathered every blanket he owned. From his bathroom, he retrieved towels, his first aid kit, and a thermometer. From his kitchen, he took bowls for water and anything that could serve as a makeshift medical tool. The garage was where he kept his emergency supplies, and Christopher quickly gathered everything that might help. Space blankets designed for hypothermia, chemical heat packs, distilled water, and even some veterinary supplies he had purchased when he first moved to Alaska, thinking he might need to treat injured wildlife from a distance. All the while, the mother bear watched his every movement. Her head turned to follow him as he moved around the cabin, but she never moved from her position near her cub. She seemed to understand that the strange two-legged creature was trying to help, and she was giving him space to work. Occasionally, she would lean down to gently nuzzle her baby, making soft sounds that Christopher recognized as the universal language of maternal comfort. Setting up a makeshift treatment area on his living room floor, Christopher spread out blankets and carefully arranged his supplies. He had treated hypothermic patients before, but never a bear cub, never under these conditions, and certainly never with a protective mother watching his every move. One wrong action, one movement she interpreted as threatening, and she could end his life before he could blink. The cub's temperature was dangerously low, even lower than Christopher had feared. Its pulse was weak but detectable, which meant there was still hope. Working with the kind of focused calm that had made him an excellent emergency physician, Christopher began the slow process of rewarming. Too fast, and he could send the cub into shock. Too slow, and hypothermia would claim another victim. He wrapped the tiny bear in warm towels, activated heat packs and positioned them carefully to avoid burns, and created a nest of blankets that would trap body heat, while allowing him to monitor breathing and heart rate. Every few minutes, he would check the cub's temperature, adjusting his treatment based on the gradual improvement he was seeing. The mother bear never interfered. She watched, occasionally making soft vocalizations that Christopher interpreted as encouragement or questions about her baby's condition. At one point, when Christopher was repositioning the cub to check its breathing, she leaned forward slightly, and Christopher's heart stopped. But she simply sniffed the air near her baby, then settled back, seemingly satisfied that the strange healing ritual was helping. Hours passed. Christopher lost track of time as he focused entirely on his patient. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside his cabin, a different kind of miracle was taking place. Slowly, incrementally, the cub's condition began to improve. Its breathing became more regular. Its body temperature crept toward normal ranges. Its tiny paws, which had been frighteningly cold, began to warm under Christopher's careful ministrations. Around midnight, the cub stirred for the first time. Just a slight movement, barely perceptible, but to Christopher it was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. The mother bear noticed immediately, leaning forward with renewed hope in her eyes. Christopher continued his treatment, monitoring vital signs and adjusting warmth levels, but he could feel the tide turning. By dawn, the cub was breathing normally, and its temperature had stabilized. It still wasn't fully conscious, but Christopher knew from experience that recovery from severe hypothermia was often gradual. The important thing was that the crisis had passed. The little bear was going to live. Looking at the mother bear, Christopher saw something that transcended every barrier between their species. It was gratitude, pure and simple, mixed with a relief so profound it was almost tangible. She understood what had happened here. She understood that her desperate gamble had paid off, that her trust in this strange creature had saved her baby's life. As the first pale light of dawn began to filter through the frosted windows, Christopher realized he hadn't slept for over 24 hours. His back ached from hunching over the tiny patient. His eyes burned from the strain of monitoring every subtle change in the cub's condition, and his hands were cramped from maintaining the delicate balance of warming treatments. But he had never felt more awake, more alive, more connected to his purpose as a healer. The mother bear had remained vigilant throughout the night, positioning herself where she could watch both her cub and Christopher simultaneously. She dozed occasionally, but never for more than a few minutes at a time. Her maternal instincts were at their peak, every sense attuned to her baby's condition and the potential threat posed by the human who was trying to save its life. Christopher found himself talking to her as he worked, using the same soft, reassuring tone he had perfected over years of treating frightened patients and comforting worried families. "His breathing is getting stronger," he would murmur as he adjusted the heat packs. "Temperature's coming up nicely. He's a fighter just like his mama." The bear's ears would twitch at the sound of his voice, and occasionally she would respond with a low rumble that Christopher chose to interpret as appreciation. Around 3 a.m, the cub had experienced what Christopher recognized as a critical moment. Its breathing had become irregular, its tiny body convulsing slightly as its system struggled to regulate temperature and circulation. Christopher had seen this before in hypothermia cases, the moment when the body's attempts to rewarm itself could trigger dangerous cardiac episodes. Working with the steady precision that had made him one of Chicago's most respected emergency physicians, Christopher had adjusted his treatment protocol. He slowed the rewarming process, monitored the cub's pulse more frequently, and prepared for the possibility that he might need to perform some kind of resuscitation. The mother bear had sensed the increased urgency, rising to her feet and pacing nervously behind Christopher as he worked. "Easy, Mama," Christopher had whispered, never taking his eyes off his patient. "He's okay. We're going to get through this together." And somehow, impossibly, his words seemed to calm her. She settled back down, but Christopher could feel her intense focus like a physical presence behind him. The crisis had passed after about an hour, but it left Christopher shaken. He realized just how close they had come to losing the little bear, and how devastated the mother would have been if her desperate journey had ended in failure. The weight of responsibility he felt was unlike anything he had experienced in medicine before. This wasn't just about saving a life, it was about honoring the trust of a creature who had overcome every instinct to seek his help. As the hours wore on, Christopher began to notice subtle changes in the dynamic between himself and the mother bear. She was relaxing incrementally, her posture becoming less defensive, her movements more natural. At one point, when Christopher had to step away to get more supplies from the kitchen, she actually shifted position to get a better view of her cub, rather than tracking Christopher's movements. The most remarkable moment came around 5 a.m, when the cub stirred more significantly than before, making a small sound that was unmistakably a baby's cry for its mother. The mother bear immediately moved closer, but instead of pushing Christopher away, she positioned herself alongside him, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her massive body. For several minutes, they worked together in a way that defied everything Christopher thought he knew about wild animals. The mother would gently nuzzle her cub, while Christopher checked vital signs and adjusted blankets. When Christopher needed to reposition the little bear, the mother would step back just enough to give him room, then move close again once he was finished. It was as if they had become a medical team, united by their shared concern for their tiny patient. Christopher found himself marveling at the intelligence in the mother bear's eyes. She was clearly understanding not just what he was doing, but why he was doing it. When he would check the cub's temperature, she would watch the thermometer with what appeared to be genuine interest. When he would make notes in his journal about the cub's progress, she would peer at the writing as if trying to decipher his hieroglyphic reports. The storm outside had reached its peak around 4 in the morning, with winds that Christopher estimated were approaching hurricane force. The sound was terrifying, like a freight train that never passed, punctuated by the crack of falling trees and the groan of his cabin's framework under extreme stress. But inside, in the warm glow of his fireplace, a different kind of miracle was unfolding. "I was terrified," Christopher would write in his journal weeks later, trying to capture the complexity of emotions he had experienced that night. Not just of the bear, though that fear never completely left. I was terrified of failing her. This mother had brought me her most precious possession, had trusted me with the one thing that mattered more to her than her own life. The weight of that trust was almost unbearable. But there was something else he would write about, something that surprised him with its intensity. Despite the fear, despite the impossible circumstances, despite the fact that he was sharing his home with a wild predator, Christopher felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. For the first time since leaving Chicago, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. As dawn approached and the cub's condition continued to stabilize, Christopher realized that the longest night of his life had also been one of the most meaningful. He had rediscovered something he thought he had lost forever: the pure joy of healing, uncomplicated by politics or bureaucracy or insurance forms. Just a doctor, a patient, and a mother's love that had transcended every barrier between the human and natural worlds. By the time the sun finally broke through the storm clouds, painting Christopher's cabin in shades of gold and amber, the little cub was not only breathing normally, but beginning to show signs of genuine recovery. Its eyes, which had been closed throughout the night, began to flutter open occasionally, revealing bright, curious pupils that seemed to take in the strange new world it had awakened to. Christopher was exhausted, but exhilarated. In the past 6 hours, he had watched a dying creature return to life through sheer determination and careful medical intervention. But more than that, he had witnessed something he never could have imagined: the birth of trust between species that nature had designed to fear each other. The mother bear had been dozing lightly when her cub made its first real sound of the morning, a tiny mewling cry that was music to both their ears. Her massive head lifted immediately, and she leaned forward to gently nuzzle her baby. The cub responded by nuzzling back, a gesture so tender and natural that Christopher felt tears spring to his eyes. What happened next would remain etched in Christopher's memory for the rest of his life. The cub, still weak but clearly more alert, began to look around its surroundings with growing curiosity. Its gaze wandered over the unfamiliar indoor environment, taking in the fireplace, the furniture, the strange smells and textures of human habitation. Then its eyes found Christopher. For a long moment, the tiny bear simply stared at him with an expression of what Christopher could only describe as recognition. Not fear, not confusion, but something approaching understanding. It was as if the cub somehow knew that this two-legged creature had been responsible for its return from the edge of death. The mother bear noticed the interaction and turned her own gaze toward Christopher. What passed between them in that moment transcended every boundary between human and animal. Christopher saw intelligence in her dark eyes and gratitude, and something else that took his breath away: acceptance. She was no longer looking at him as a potential threat to be tolerated for her cub's sake. She was looking at him as, what? A partner? An ally? A friend? Christopher moved slowly, telegraphing his intentions as he reached for his water bowl to check the cub's hydration level. The mother bear watched but didn't tense. When Christopher gently touched the cub's tiny paw to check its temperature, the mother actually moved closer, as if she wanted to observe his examination technique. The cub, meanwhile, seemed fascinated by Christopher's presence. When he would speak softly, explaining what he was doing, the little bear's ears would perk up, and its head would tilt in Christopher's direction. At one point, when Christopher was adjusting the blankets around its tiny body, the cub reached out with one small paw and touched his hand. The contact was electric. Christopher had touched thousands of patients over his career, but this was different. This tiny creature, which should have instinctively feared humans, was reaching out to him with complete trust. The touch was gentle, exploratory, as if the cub was trying to understand what kind of creature had saved its life. The mother bear observed this interaction with what Christopher interpreted as approval. She made a soft sound, almost like a purr, that seemed to encourage her cub's curiosity about their unusual benefactor. When the cub continued to reach toward Christopher, she didn't intervene or redirect its attention. Instead, she settled more comfortably into her position, as if she was prepared to stay and observe this unprecedented interspecies bonding session. Christopher found himself talking to both bears as if they were patients in his emergency room. "You're doing great, little one. Your mom is so proud of you. You both are incredibly brave." The mother bear's ears would twitch at the sound of his voice, and occasionally she would respond with gentle vocalizations that Christopher began to recognize as her way of participating in the conversation. As the morning progressed and the cub continued to strengthen, Christopher realized something profound had happened during their night together. Three creatures who should have been natural enemies had instead become something unprecedented. A family of choice, bound together by crisis and mutual care. The cub had imprinted not just on its mother, but on Christopher as well. And the mother bear had done something that went against millions of years of evolutionary programming. She had chosen to trust a human completely, not just with her own life, but with the life of her offspring. Christopher knew that what he was experiencing was beyond rare. Wildlife biologists spent decades hoping for moments of connection with wild animals that lasted mere seconds. He had been given hours of intimate interaction, had been accepted into the most sacred space in the animal kingdom, the bond between mother and child. As he watched the cub playfully bat at its mother's massive paw while keeping one eye on Christopher, he understood that something had changed in him forever. He was no longer just an observer of nature. He had become part of it. The second day brought a different kind of tension to the cabin. The storm had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a world transformed by snow so deep it had reshaped the very landscape. Christopher woke to brilliant sunshine streaming through windows that framed a scene of pristine beauty, but also to the reality that his unusual houseguests would soon need to return to their natural habitat. The cub had made remarkable progress overnight. It was sitting up on its own, taking small amounts of water, and showing the kind of alert curiosity that Christopher recognized as a sign of full neurological recovery. The little bear was fascinated by everything in the cabin, from the crackling fireplace to the way morning light danced across the wooden walls. But most of all, it seemed fascinated by Christopher himself. The mother bear had been restless since dawn, occasionally moving to the windows to look out at the snow-covered forest beyond. Christopher could sense her internal struggle. Her maternal instincts told her to stay close to the safety and warmth that had saved her cub's life, but her wild nature was calling her back to the forest where she belonged. Christopher understood the dilemma perfectly. In the hospital, there always came a moment when it was time to discharge a patient, even when both doctor and family had grown attached during the healing process. This was that moment, multiplied by the complexity of species, and the knowledge that once these bears left, he would likely never see them again. He spent the morning preparing for their departure, gathering supplies he thought might help them transition back to the wild. He filled containers with clean water and left them near the door. He researched everything he could remember about bear nutrition and prepared a mixture of foods that would give them energy for whatever journey lay ahead. The mother bear seemed to understand his preparations. She began moving around the cabin with purpose, occasionally approaching her cub and making soft vocalizations that Christopher interpreted as encouragement to get ready for travel. The cub, however, seemed reluctant to leave its new comfort zone. It had discovered the joy of warmth and safety, and the prospect of returning to the harsh winter environment clearly held little appeal. Around midday, the mother bear made her decision. She moved to her cub and began the process of coaxing it toward the door. The little bear protested, looking back toward Christopher with what appeared to be confusion and disappointment. Christopher felt his heart breaking as he watched the tiny creature that had trusted him so completely struggle to understand why it had to leave. The goodbye was more difficult than Christopher had anticipated. The cub approached him one last time, reaching out to touch his hand with the same gentle curiosity it had shown the day before. Christopher knelt down and allowed the contact, memorizing the feeling of that small paw against his palm. "You're going to be okay, little one," he whispered. "Your mama will take good care of you." The mother bear approached then, and for a moment, Christopher thought she might be coming to retrieve her cub. Instead, she did something that took his breath away. She walked directly up to Christopher and very gently touched her massive nose to his hand. It was deliberate, intentional, unmistakably a gesture of gratitude and farewell. Christopher remained perfectly still as the enormous bear investigated his scent one last time, as if she was memorizing him the same way he was memorizing her. Then she stepped back and looked directly into his eyes. In that gaze, Christopher saw intelligence, dignity, and a recognition that what had happened between them was extraordinary. The departure itself was swift. The mother bear gently but firmly guided her cub toward the door, and despite its reluctance, the little bear followed its mother's lead. Christopher opened the door and stepped aside, watching as they moved out into the brilliant white world beyond his cabin. At the edge of the tree line, both bears turned back. The cub seemed to be trying to run back toward the cabin, but its mother held it steady with one massive paw. For a long moment, all three of them remained frozen in that tableau. Christopher in his doorway, the bears at the threshold between civilization and wilderness. Then they were gone, disappearing into the forest as suddenly and completely as if they had never existed at all. Christopher stood in his empty doorway for a long time, listening to the silence that seemed deafening after 2 days of shared presence. The cabin felt enormous and hollow without them. Life had found its rhythm again in Christopher's small corner of Alaska. 2 years had passed since the night of the storm, and while he had never forgotten his unusual visitors, the intensity of that memory had settled into something softer, like a treasured photograph that becomes more precious with time. He had learned to live with the certainty that he would never see them again, that his brief intersection with their wild lives had been a singular gift that could never be repeated. Christopher had changed in those 2 years. The experience with the bears had awakened something in him that he hadn't even realized was dormant. He found himself paying closer attention to the wildlife around his property, learning to read the subtle signs of animal behavior with an acuity that surprised him. He kept detailed journals of his observations, documenting migration patterns, social interactions, and seasonal behaviors with the same methodical approach he had once applied to medical charts. His cabin had become an unofficial wildlife sanctuary, not through any deliberate action on his part, but because animals seemed to sense something different about him now. Injured birds appeared on his deck with increasing frequency. A family of raccoons had taken up permanent residence under his porch. Even the normally skittish deer would graze within sight of his windows, showing none of the wariness they displayed around other human structures in the area. Christopher had started keeping basic veterinary supplies on hand just in case. He told himself it was simple preparedness, but deep down he knew he was hoping for another chance to help, another opportunity to bridge the gap between human and wild. He had contacted a wildlife rehabilitator in Anchorage and learned proper techniques for treating common injuries and illnesses. His medical background made him a quick study, and within months, he had become the unofficial wildlife medic for a 20-mile radius. On this particular morning in early October, Christopher was sitting on his deck with his first cup of coffee, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The air was crisp with the promise of winter, and the first snow of the season was forecast for later in the week. It was the kind of morning that made him grateful for his decision to leave the chaos of city life behind. He was reviewing his journal entries from the previous week when something caught his attention at the edge of his peripheral vision. A movement among the trees that was too deliberate to be caused by wind, too large to be a smaller animal. Christopher set down his coffee and stood up slowly, not wanting to startle whatever creature might be approaching. At first, he saw nothing but shadows and morning light filtering through the forest. Then a shape emerged from behind a massive pine tree, and Christopher's heart nearly stopped. It was a bear, large and dark, moving with the confident gait of an animal that knew exactly where it was going. But this wasn't unusual in itself. Bears were common in his area, and Christopher had learned to coexist peacefully with the occasional visitor. What made this different, what made Christopher's breath catch in his throat, was the second shape that emerged from the forest. A younger bear, smaller but fully grown, moving alongside the first with a familiarity that spoke of a deep bond. Christopher watched, transfixed, as the pair moved closer to his property with none of the wariness that wild bears typically displayed around human habitation. The larger bear stopped at the exact spot where Christopher had last seen his visitors 2 years ago. She stood there for a moment as if testing the air for familiar scents, for memories that might confirm what she already seemed to know. Then she turned her massive head directly toward Christopher's deck, and their eyes met across the distance. Recognition hit Christopher like a physical blow. The eyes were the same, intelligent and alert, but there was something else now. Something that made his vision blur with sudden tears. It was her. Impossibly, incredibly, it was the mother bear who had trusted him with her dying cub 2 years ago. And the younger bear beside her, now strong and healthy and magnificent, could only be that same tiny creature he had spent a night saving. Christopher stood perfectly still, afraid that any movement might shatter this impossible moment. The bears remained where they were, clearly aware of his presence but showing no signs of fear or aggression. The younger bear, which Christopher now realized must be approaching full adulthood, seemed particularly interested in the cabin, its head tilted in a posture that reminded Christopher powerfully of that night 2 years ago. For several minutes, none of them moved. Christopher felt as if he was witnessing something beyond the normal boundaries of the natural world, a moment when the veil between species lifted to reveal connections that transcended every rule he thought he understood. These bears had traveled how far to return to this place? They had remembered not just the location, but the specific human who had helped them in their darkest hour. The young bear took a step forward, as if it might approach the cabin, but its mother gently blocked the movement. Christopher understood. This wasn't a request for help or an attempt to renew their unusual relationship. This was something else entirely, something that made Christopher's throat tighten with emotion he couldn't quite name. This was a homecoming, a completion of a circle that had begun 2 years ago in desperation and fear, and was ending now in something that looked remarkably like peace. What happened next transcended every boundary Christopher thought existed between the human and natural worlds. The mother bear, still maintaining that steady eye contact that had defined their relationship from the very beginning, began to move toward him with deliberate, unhurried steps. There was no aggression in her posture, no threat in her approach. Instead, there was something ceremonial about her movement, as if she was participating in a ritual that both of them understood on a level deeper than conscious thought. Christopher remained perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Every instinct told him this was impossible, that wild bears simply didn't behave this way. But then again, nothing about his relationship with these particular bears had followed conventional patterns. From the moment she had first approached his cabin in that deadly blizzard, they had been writing their own rules. The young bear followed its mother, staying slightly behind but clearly eager to be part of whatever was happening. Christopher could see so much of the tiny, helpless cub in this magnificent creature's movements. The same curiosity, the same intelligence, the same surprising gentleness that had marked their first encounter. But now those qualities were housed in a powerful, fully grown bear that could have been a threat to anything in the forest. When the mother bear reached the edge of Christopher's deck, she stopped. For a long moment she simply stood there, looking up at him with those dark, intelligent eyes that had haunted his dreams for 2 years. Christopher could see something working in her expression, some complex thought process that was trying to communicate across the vast gulf between their species. Then, slowly and deliberately, she lowered her massive head. It wasn't a submissive gesture or a sign of fear. It was something else entirely, something that made Christopher's eyes fill with tears he didn't try to hide. It was a bow, formal, intentional, unmistakable in its meaning. She was acknowledging what had passed between them, honoring the debt she felt she owed, expressing gratitude in the only way her kind knew how. The young bear, watching its mother, seemed to understand the significance of the moment. It too lowered its head, mimicking its mother's gesture with a grace that suggested this was learned behavior, passed down from parent to child like the most important of life lessons. Christopher found himself responding without conscious thought. He placed his hand over his heart and nodded deeply, a gesture of acknowledgement and respect that felt as natural as breathing. In that moment, he wasn't a human being encountering wild animals. He was simply one living creature acknowledging the profound connection he shared with two others. The ceremony lasted only seconds, but Christopher knew he would remember every detail for the rest of his life. The way the morning light caught the bear's dark fur, the absolute stillness of the forest around them, as if nature itself was holding its breath, the feeling of being part of something ancient and sacred, a bond that existed outside the normal boundaries of the civilized world. When the mother bear lifted her head, there was something different in her eyes, a sense of completion, as if a circle that had been opened 2 years ago was finally being closed. She looked at Christopher one last time, and he could have sworn he saw something that looked like a smile in her expression. Then she turned and began walking back toward the forest, her offspring following close behind. They moved with the same unhurried dignity they had shown throughout their visit, but Christopher could sense the finality in their departure. This was goodbye, not just for now, but forever. At the tree line, both bears turned for one final look. Christopher raised his hand in farewell, and though he knew it was impossible, he could have sworn they both nodded in response before disappearing into the wilderness that was their true home. Christopher stood on his deck long after the bears had vanished into the forest, his hand still raised in farewell, his heart still pounding from the extraordinary encounter he had just witnessed. The morning air was crisp against his face, but he barely noticed the cold. His mind was reeling with the implications of what had just happened, with the profound beauty of a connection that had survived 2 years of separation and culminated in a moment of pure, interspecies understanding. As he finally lowered his hand and walked back into his cabin, Christopher realized that his life had been forever changed not once, but twice by the same remarkable creatures. 2 years ago, they had taught him that compassion knows no boundaries, that healing is a universal language, and that trust can bridge even the vastest gaps between different worlds. Today, they had taught him something equally profound, that gratitude, like love, transcends every barrier we think exists between species. The story of Christopher and his bear family isn't just about one man's extraordinary encounter with wildlife. It's about the connections that bind all living creatures together, about the courage it takes to open our hearts to those who seem different from us, and about the miraculous things that can happen when we choose compassion over fear. In a world that often feels divided, where differences seem to matter more than similarities, stories like this remind us of a fundamental truth. We are all part of the same intricate web of life. The mother bear who trusted a human stranger with her most precious possession, the man who risked everything to save a dying creature, and the young bear who learned that kindness can come from the most unexpected sources. They all teach us that empathy is perhaps the most powerful force in the natural world. Christopher's journey from burned-out emergency physician to wilderness hermit to unlikely wildlife healer mirrors a transformation that many of us yearn for in our own lives. We all seek meaning, purpose, and connection. We all want to believe that our actions matter, that we can make a difference in the world around us. Christopher's story proves that sometimes the most profound impacts come not from grand gestures or public recognition, but from simple acts of kindness performed when no one is watching, except the creatures who need our help most. The bear's return after 2 years wasn't just a remarkable display of animal memory and intelligence. It was a testament to the enduring power of gratitude, a reminder that good deeds create ripples that extend far beyond our ability to see or understand their full impact. In saving one small life, Christopher had earned the lifelong respect of an entire family of wild creatures who understood in their own way the value of what he had given them. If this story has touched your heart, if it has reminded you of the connections that bind all living things together, then you understand why stories like this matter. They don't just entertain us, they transform us. They remind us that in a world that can feel harsh and unforgiving, there is still room for wonder, for compassion, for the kind of magic that happens when different species recognize their shared humanity. This is just one story among thousands of remarkable encounters between humans and wildlife happening every day around the world. Stories of veterinarians who risk their lives to save endangered species, of ordinary people who open their hearts to injured animals, of the incredible bonds that form when we choose to see beyond the boundaries that typically separate us. The next chapter in this journey of wild hearts is waiting for you, filled with more incredible stories of connection, compassion, and the unbreakable bonds that unite all living creatures. Because when we open our hearts to the wild things of this world, we discover that they have been waiting to open their hearts to us as well.